I think the stock market has already given us a vote of no confidence. I mean, the president, I think, really is flailing around now in a failed presidency. And I think the architect of that is Timothy Geithner. And when someone fails and they're the head of a country or the head of an organization, they need to go.
He was going. And then he was like, oh, no, the crisis is too big, I better stay. I mean,
well, you know, when you talk about people being tone deaf, I think the president might be tone deaf if the economy is in shambles, and in the midst of that, he's begging the person who's the architect to stick around.
Because this has just been kicked down the road again, hasn't it?
Absolutely, for one of use of a different metaphor. But yes, kicking the can down the road, that's what we're doing. And the interesting thing about this is it gets to Washington's fuzzy math. In Washington, they say, oh, we're going to cut $2 trillion. Well, they're going to cut $2 trillion from the $9 trillion in new debt they're planning on adding.
That's right.
So their plan will actually add $7 trillion in new debt.
And they're not, there's still nobody, and I mean nobody, seems to want to deal with the unfunded obligations, because the reality is we're actually $120 trillion in debt if we include the bills that haven't dropped through the mail yet, which we know are coming.
But if you put it in perspective and you tell people what it would take to actually balance the budget, if you cut 1% each year for 6 years and then froze spending at that level, you would balance the budget in 8 years. All you have to do is cut 1 penny out of every dollar that we spend at the federal level.
And there's so many ways that we can cut that.
Absolutely.
It's nonsense to say it can't be done.
But to show you where the problem is that we can't even get started. For example, when the House had a continuing resolution on spending in the spring, there was an amendment that said we would cut $300 million from Amtrak, from the lines that lose twice as much money as they bring in. These are the worst of the Amtrak lines. We couldn't get enough votes. 80, 90 Republicans bailed, all the Democrats bailed, and we couldn't cut $300 million. How are we ever going to balance a budget that's $1.5 trillion in debt if we can't even start by cutting $300 million?
And should we be even more scared now that we've seen the gang of six that the Republicans have put up? I mean, no surprises on the Democrat side, but you know, I would have liked to have seen you, frankly, Marco Rubio, Steve King from Iowa. I mean, these are the names we were looking for, people who seriously understand we've got a serious problem, and I don't think we've got that.
I will tell you, I saw Steve King today, and a lot of the conservatives in the House and the conservatives in the Senate are doing something that's never happened before. We're meeting together and talking and forming coalitions, and during this debt ceiling crisis, many of us actually proposed raising the debt ceiling and attaching it to a balanced budget amendment. That came from the conservatives in the Senate and the conservatives in the House. We plan on continuing to talk, so it's not just leadership of the parties talking. The rank and file members are going to begin to organize and begin to try to direct the agenda. One of the things that bothers me is not only the super committee, but the fact that the debt ceiling will now go up automatically. You realize that all of these triggers and all of what the super committee is supposed to be doing is not contingent on the debt ceiling rising. The debt ceiling will now rise automatically, and it used to be it took 60 votes in the Senate to raise the debt ceiling. Now it will be 34 votes when it comes up. So what will happen is there are some spending cuts against proposed increases that may have to occur, but the debt ceiling is going up regardless. So we won't have this battle again, which I think was actually a useful battle to direct the country's attention towards the deficit.
Should we have just said no?
Well, a lot of us did say no.
Well, I know, absolutely, I know.
And well, you know, what we kept pointing out is that just saying no would immediately balance the budget but wouldn't cause default. We bring in about $200 billion in tax revenue each month, and the interest payment's about $20 billion. We've got plenty of money to pay for the interest on our debt, and we should never default. So really the whole question of default was a false question. It was set up by the president to scare people.
Sure, as was the Social Security threat.
Absolutely. In fact, we had legislation that would have forced him to send out the Social Security checks, forced him to pay the soldiers' salaries, and forced him to pay interest on the debt. The Democrats all voted against it.
And, of course, you know, our very own Senator Harkin from Iowa described those of us who wanted to balance the budget as on some kind of fringe cult.
Well, it's just amazing. People are saying, oh, this is the Tea Party downgrade and calling us terrorists. And I said, well, you know what? The president's holding the economy hostage. I like to consider myself a freedom fighter, not a terrorist. That's ridiculous. And so really it's kind of to say the Tea Party is for the downgrade, sort of like, saying to firemen, you're responsible for the fire. It just makes no sense.
Yeah, a lot of people thought that you should run for president, Senator.
Well, I did, but we figured at Thanksgiving it would be kind of messy, having two Pauls running against each other. So we decided one Paul per election.
Okay. All right. Is that a little hat tip to 2016 if we don't get a conservative in the White House in 2012?
Well, if Ron Paul's the incumbent, the same rule will have to apply.
And let's obviously you're supporting your dad, and I wouldn't expect nothing less. But how likely is what you just said to happen? I mean, if we're being really honest.
Well, it would take something big to happen, like Ron Paul winning the straw poll on Saturday. Now, that's not a guarantee of anything, but if Ron Paul were to win the straw poll Saturday, it will be a shock, and it will be heard around the country, and it could propel him forward. There have been people who have won here in Iowa. Mike Huckabee's campaign was almost non-existent, and then when he won in Iowa, it shot him forward. And that's one of the neat things. I come from a small state, from Kentucky. Iowa's a small state. It shows the importance of the primary system and the importance of the Electoral College, that the reason people go and campaign in small states is because of the way we count the votes. And if we ever get rid of the Electoral College, no one will ever visit rural America.
Yeah, we're getting close to that, aren't we? Because California is just getting on board with popular vote stuff.
Yeah, and they're talking.
Story down here somewhere.
Yeah, and they're actually talking about signing a voluntary agreement to give their delegates to whoever wins the popular vote, not to who actually wins their state. So there's a way around this, that they're actually talking about circumventing the Constitution and the Electoral College and just giving their votes to whoever wins the nationwide vote, not who wins their state. That'll really be a disadvantage for states like Iowa and Kentucky.
If it was challenged in the Supreme Court, which I would expect it to be challenged, what do you think the chances of success are for the challenge?
Well, the interesting thing is they're doing this as a voluntary compact, so it might actually pass constitutional muster. Whether or not you can force the electors to vote for somebody that their state did not vote for, you may not be able to force them, but there may be some way of the state may say, we're not going to let you be an elector unless you agree to go by these rules. And so I don't know whether it'll be struck down or not as unconstitutional. I do know it's a bad idea for smaller states, and it was a great and grand bargain, and at the time of the Constitution was to give 2 senators to every state. The fact that Iowa gets 2 senators and California gets 2 senators and Kentucky gets 2 senators is a good idea, and it helps us to be, we were originally a nation of states, and now we've become more of sort of a pluralistic democracy, whereas once we were a constitutional republic and a grouping of states that came together. Some of that's been discarded over time, and I think that's a disadvantage and unfortunate. It's probably the number one thing in our schools that needs to be taught that's not being taught, the difference between a constitutional republic and a democracy, because our founding fathers, Jefferson included, said that a democracy was nothing more than mob rule, and it would be dangerous. And people should understand that a pure democracy, 51% of the people could get rid of the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, or 51% of the people could enslave 49% of the people.
On my text line, why has no Republican candidate gone on the offensive and therefore taken a large gap in Republican votes?
Well, why don't I start? I'll try. I think Romney will not be the nominee until he can explain his support for Romney Care, which appears to be the basis for Obamacare. Till he can explain cogently why he supported a health care plan that had an individual mandate, forces people to buy insurance like Obamacare, it is going to be difficult for him to be a nominee of the Republican Party.
How important is the debate tonight? Do you think everyone's going to be pretty much making sure they don't mess up, or are people just going to go out there and do their thing?
Some are real cautious, and like Tim Pawlenty being that cautious may have not allowed him to ever get a campaign going, and I think he's going to have difficulty getting a campaign started because of that. But I think tonight some will be cautious, and it won't help them. People are looking for bold leadership.
I agree.
Who are the people like Chris Christie that are admired around the country? Scott Walker, that are admired for being decisive, for saying we're out of money, and I don't care how powerful this or that union is, or this or that government workers union is, but we've got to cut back on these expenses, and they take the flack and they move forward. And I think people want a strong leader that will fix our country, will allow us to find our greatness again.
Why doesn't Congress cut its own salary? I know in the big scheme of things it won't make any difference whatsoever to our nation's trouble, but it would actually send a message.
Well, Ron Paul, many years ago, actually introduced a bill that would say we cut the congressional salaries inversely proportional to inflation. So if inflation goes up 10%, your congressman should get a 10% cut because they're the ones causing inflation through deficit financing. So it is an idea out there. Ron Paul's the only one in Congress who doesn't take the pension, doesn't take the congressional pension. Part of the Tea Party platform is we believe that every law passed should also include Congress.
Absolutely.
That Congress shall not exempt themselves from any law. So I consider that to be part of the Tea Party platform.
Senator Rand Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. I will see you at the straw poll, sir.
Enjoyed it.